Victoria Ashford had everything money could buy. Her penthouse in Manhattan stretched across the entire top floor, with windows that looked out over Central Park. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings, and original artwork decorated every wall. She was 28 years old and had never worked a day in her life. Her grandfather had built a pharmaceutical empire, and she'd inherited more money than she could spend in 3 lifetimes. Every month, Victoria threw parties. Not just any parties, but the kind that appeared in society magazines. The kind where people wore dresses that cost more than most cars and sipped champagne that was older than some of the guests. These gatherings weren't really about having fun. They were about being seen, about staying relevant in New York's elite circles, about proving she belonged at the top. Victoria spent weeks planning each event. She hired the best caterers, the most exclusive florists, and always had live music. Usually she booked a pianist months in advance, someone classically trained, someone who knew exactly what to play while her guests pretended to care about whatever charity she was promoting that month. This particular evening was supposed to be special. She'd organized a fundraiser for arts education, though she couldn't remember the last time she'd actually been to a museum or concert. What mattered was that the right people would be there. City council members, gallery owners, a few minor celebrities, and most importantly, the Rothsteins. The Rothsteins controlled half the art market in New York, and getting close to them could open doors even Victoria's money couldn't buy. Everything was perfect. The flowers had arrived on time, enormous white orchids that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The caterer had confirmed the menu twice. The champagne was chilling. Victoria had spent 3 hours that afternoon getting ready, trying on 4 different dresses before settling on a sleek black number that screamed sophisticated wealth. Then her phone rang. It was the pianist calling from a hospital waiting room. His mother had fallen, broken her hip. He was so sorry, but he couldn't make it. He could try to find a replacement. Maybe someone would be available, though on such short notice. Victoria hung up without letting him finish. Her guests would arrive in less than 2 hours. She couldn't have a party without music. It would look cheap, incomplete, like she hadn't planned properly. She paced across her marble floors, her heels clicking with each anxious step. This couldn't be happening. Not tonight. Not when the Rothsteins were coming. That's when she heard it. The soft sound of someone humming in the kitchen. She walked toward the sound and found Maria, her housekeeper, arranging appetizers on silver trays. Next to her, sitting at the small kitchen table with textbooks spread out in front of him, was Maria's son. Victoria rarely paid attention to the boy. She knew Maria had a son, of course. He was around sometimes after school, doing homework quietly in corners where he wouldn't be in the way. She thought his name was Daniel or maybe David. She wasn't entirely sure. To her, he was just part of the background of her life, like the furniture or the paintings on her walls. Maria, Victoria said, her voice sharp with stress. I have a problem. Maria looked up immediately, concern crossing her face. She'd worked for Victoria for 3 years now, long enough to know that tone. What's wrong, Miss Ashford? My pianist canceled. The guests arrive in less than 2 hours. Victoria pressed her fingers to her temples as if this was the worst crisis imaginable. I need music. I can't have this event without music. Maria nodded sympathetically, though she was probably thinking about the million more important problems people faced every day. Maybe you could play recorded music? Classical stations? Recorded? Victoria looked horrified. No, that's not the same at all. It needs to be live. It needs to be... She trailed off, her eyes landing on Daniel. A memory surfaced, something Maria had mentioned months ago. Wait, doesn't your son play piano? Daniel looked up from his calculus homework, surprised to be noticed. He was 16, tall for his age, but with that awkward teenage quality of someone still growing into himself. He had his mother's dark eyes and quiet demeanor, the kind of kid who'd learned early to make himself invisible in spaces where he didn't quite belong. He takes lessons at school, Maria said carefully. But Miss Ashford, I don't think... Perfect. Victoria cut her off, already moving on to solve her problem. She didn't notice the hesitation in Maria's voice or the complex expression on Daniel's face. He can play tonight. Just some background music. Nothing complicated. Miss Ashford, he's only been learning for... Maria tried again, but Victoria was already walking toward her study, calling back over her shoulder. Have him ready by 7. Tell him to wear something nice. Black if possible. And Maria, make sure he understands it's just background music. Simple classical pieces. Nothing that will distract from the conversations. She disappeared around the corner, already on her phone trying to solve the next small crisis of flower arrangements. Behind her in the kitchen, Maria and Daniel looked at each other. "Mom, I can't," Daniel said quietly. His hands were trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from something else. "Something complicated, I know, sweetheart. But we need this job." Maria's voice was gentle but firm. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Just play what she asks. Keep it simple. Don't draw attention." Daniel nodded slowly, but his mind was already racing. He looked down at his hands. These hands that had spent countless hours on piano keys. These hands that could do so much more than Victoria Ashford could possibly imagine. Because what Victoria didn't know, what she'd never bothered to ask or notice, was that Daniel wasn't just some kid who took piano lessons at school. He'd been playing since he was 7, teaching himself from library books and YouTube videos when his mother couldn't afford proper lessons. He'd won competitions, small ones that didn't make the news, the kind held in community centers and public school auditoriums, the kind of competitions that people like Victoria never attended. He'd composed his own music too. 12 original pieces, each one born from late nights when his mother thought he was sleeping, when the city sounds filtered through their small apartment windows and his fingers found stories in the keys. But standing in Victoria Ashford's gleaming kitchen, surrounded by marble and gold and careless wealth, Daniel understood his role. He wasn't being asked to play because anyone cared about his music. He was being asked because he was convenient, because he was there, because his mother needed to keep this job that paid their rent. He was just the maid's son, filling in where needed. Nothing more. At least that's what Victoria thought. She grabbed a piece of paper and scribbled down a list of songs. Chopin, Beethoven, Debussy, the classics everyone knew. "Here," she said, thrusting the paper at him. "These should work. Just keep it pleasant and quiet." Then she was gone again, her heels clicking away, already forgetting about him. Daniel stared at the list in his hands. Around him, his mother returned to preparing food for people who would barely notice her work. And somewhere in his chest, something shifted. Tonight was going to be interesting, even if nobody realized it yet. Daniel sat at the Steinway grand piano in the corner of Victoria's living room and tried not to think about how much it cost. Probably more than his mother made in 5 years. The keys were perfect, pristine ivory that had barely been touched. Victoria owned this incredible instrument the way she owned everything else, as decoration, as proof of wealth, not because she actually cared about music. He'd changed into the one dress shirt he owned, black like Victoria requested. His mother had ironed it quickly while he'd splashed water on his face and tried to calm his nerves. Now he sat on the bench, his back straight, his hands resting lightly on the keys, and waited. The guests started arriving at 7 sharp. They came in waves of expensive perfume and cologne, designer suits and dresses that probably cost more than Daniel's entire wardrobe combined. They air-kissed each other's cheeks and said things like "darling" and "absolutely divine," while servers Maria had hired for the night circulated with champagne and tiny appetizers that were more art than food. Nobody looked at Daniel, not once. He might as well have been another piece of furniture, sitting there in his corner, which he supposed was exactly what Victoria wanted. Background music, pleasant and quiet. Don't distract from the conversations. He started playing. First, a Chopin nocturne from Victoria's list. His fingers moved across the keys with practiced ease, finding the melody, adding the gentle ornamentation that made Chopin sound like falling water. The music was beautiful, objectively beautiful, but nobody noticed. A woman in a red dress walked right past the piano, so close her sleeve nearly touched Daniel's shoulder, and she never even glanced his way. Next, he moved into Debussy. Clair de Lune, because everyone knew it, because it was safe and pretty and exactly what people expected to hear at events like this. A man stood 3 feet from the piano, talking loudly about real estate investments, his voice drowning out the delicate passages Daniel was playing. The man never once acknowledged that someone was sitting there, creating live music just for him. Daniel kept playing. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the first movement. Then some Mozart, light and airy. He worked through Victoria's list methodically, professionally, giving each piece the respect it deserved even though nobody was listening. His mother passed by once carrying a tray of champagne flutes, and their eyes met for just a second. She gave him a small smile, proud and sad at the same time. An hour passed, then another. Daniel's fingers never faltered, even though inside he felt something building. A frustration, maybe, or something deeper than that. All these people dressed in their expensive clothes, drinking wine that cost hundreds of dollars per bottle, and not one of them actually heard the music. They consumed it the way they consumed everything else, without really paying attention, without caring about where it came from or who created it. Victoria floated through the room like a queen, touching arms and laughing at jokes that probably weren't funny. She'd glance toward the piano occasionally, but she looked through Daniel rather than at him. He was performing his function. That was all that mattered to her. The evening was going well. She'd secured a major donation from someone. He could tell by the triumphant way she held herself. Mission accomplished. Something shifted in Daniel then. Maybe it was the way that woman in the red dress had walked past him like he was invisible. Maybe it was watching his mother serve people who didn't say thank you. Maybe it was just being 16 and tired of being quiet. Tired of making himself small in spaces that had so much room. His fingers drifted away from Victoria's playlist. He didn't plan it, didn't think about it. He just let his hands find their own path across the keys. And suddenly he wasn't playing Chopin or Beethoven anymore. He was playing his own music. A piece he'd written 6 months ago, late at night in their small apartment while his mother slept. He called it The Weight of Water in his head, though he'd never told anyone that. It started soft, almost like Debussy, gentle ripples of sound. But then it grew, became something else. The melody told a story, his mother's story, though the guests would never know that. It spoke of leaving everything behind, of crossing an ocean with nothing but hope and a suitcase, of working jobs that made your back ache and your hands crack, of loving a son so much that you scrubbed rich people's toilets so he could have books and piano lessons. The music swelled, Daniel's hands moving faster now, more confident. He added complexity, layers of sound that wove together like conversation. There was pain in it, yes, but also strength, beauty born from struggle. Hope that refused to die even when everything was hard. Near the piano, a conversation faltered. A woman holding a champagne glass stopped mid-sentence, her head turning slightly toward the sound. She looked confused, like she couldn't quite figure out what was different. This didn't sound like background music anymore. A few more people paused. Not many, maybe 5 or 6 out of the 50 guests scattered around the room. They weren't sure why they'd stopped talking, couldn't quite put their finger on what had changed. The music just was suddenly there, demanding to be heard instead of ignored. In the back corner of the room, near the windows overlooking the park, an elderly man set down his wineglass. He'd been standing alone, looking bored, probably wishing he hadn't accepted Victoria's invitation. His name was Lawrence Whitmore, though Daniel didn't know that. Lawrence was 73 years old, and he'd spent 50 of those years in music. He'd conducted orchestras, produced albums for legends, discovered talents that went on to win Grammys and international acclaim. He'd retired 5 years ago, tired of the industry, tired of fake people and fake music. He rarely went to events anymore, but Victoria's mother had been a friend of his late wife, and he'd felt obligated to make an appearance. He'd been planning to leave after one drink, but now he stood frozen, his entire body suddenly alert. His trained ear, the one that had heard tens of thousands of performances over 5 decades, recognized immediately what was happening at that piano. This wasn't just good. This wasn't even just excellent. This was something else entirely. Something rare. Lawrence moved closer, weaving through conversations he didn't hear anymore. His focus had narrowed to a single point: the boy at the piano. The teenager in the cheap black shirt who was playing music that shouldn't exist. Music that had no business being this mature, this emotionally intelligent, this technically perfect. Where did this come from? Who was this kid? And more importantly, how had he ended up playing background music at a socialite's party? The piece built to its climax, Daniel's fingers flying across the keys with a precision that looked effortless but wasn't. The sound filled the room now, impossible to ignore. Even people who'd been deep in conversation found themselves pausing, turning, trying to locate the source of this unexpected beauty. Victoria was across the room, talking to the Rothsteins, her back to the piano. She didn't notice the shift in atmosphere, didn't realize that people were staring toward her corner. She was mid-sentence, saying something about her commitment to the arts when the music finally ended. Daniel's hands stilled on the keys. For a moment, the room was completely quiet. Then the conversations resumed, people shaking their heads slightly as if coming out of a trance. They went back to their champagne and their small talk, already forgetting what they'd heard. But Lawrence Whitmore didn't move. He stood 10 feet from the piano, staring at Daniel with an intensity that made the teenager nervous. This was the first person all night who'd actually looked at him, really looked at him, and Daniel didn't know what to do with that attention. Their eyes met across the space. Lawrence saw a scared kid trying to figure out if he'd done something wrong. Daniel saw an old man who looked at him like he was actually a person, not furniture. Neither of them knew it yet, but in that moment, everything changed. Daniel quickly shifted back to the playlist, his hands finding a safe Mozart piece. He kept his eyes down, his heart pounding, but he could feel Lawrence still watching, still standing there. And he knew with absolute certainty that something had shifted. Someone had finally heard him, really heard him. The party continued around them, oblivious. Victoria secured another donation. His mother cleared empty plates, and Daniel played on back to being invisible again. But the old man in the corner kept watching, kept listening, and for the first time in his life, Daniel felt truly seen. The last guest left around midnight. Daniel had been playing for almost 5 hours straight, and his shoulders ached in that good way that comes from doing something you love for too long. He flexed his fingers, working out the stiffness, and started gathering the sheet music he'd brought. Most of it he hadn't even used. He'd played from memory like he always did. Victoria clicked past in her heels, barely slowing down. "Fine job tonight," she said. The words tossed over her shoulder like spare change. She was already pulling out her phone, probably checking social media to see if anyone had posted about her event. "You can go now, just like that." 5 hours of music reduced to 2 words and a dismissal. Daniel shouldn't have expected anything else, but somehow it still stung a little. He carefully stacked his sheet music and stood up from the bench, ready to find his mother so they could finally go home. "Excuse me." The voice came from behind him, deep, measured with the kind of authority that made Daniel turn around immediately. It was the old man, the one who'd been watching him. Up close, Daniel could see he was tall, with white hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through you. He wore an expensive suit, but unlike the other guests, he wore it like he didn't care about it, like clothes were just something you had to put on. "Yes, sir," Daniel said, unsure what else to say. "Who taught you to play like that?" Lawrence asked. No introduction, no small talk. Just straight to the question that had been burning in his mind for the past hour. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "I take lessons at school, and I watch videos online, practice when I can." Lawrence's eyebrows rose. School lessons. YouTube videos. He said it like he was trying to make sense of a foreign language. "What about composition? Who taught you to write music?" "Write music?" Daniel's voice came out smaller than he intended. I don't know. I hear things in my head sometimes and I try to play them. Nobody taught me. I just do it." For a long moment, Lawrence just stared at him. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed. Not a mean laugh, but one of pure disbelief mixed with something that might have been joy. "Of course you do. Of course." He shook his head. "What's your name, son?" "Daniel Chen." "Daniel." Lawrence pulled a card from his jacket pocket. Heavy cardstock, expensive. "I'm Lawrence Whitmore. I used to conduct orchestras, produce albums. Now I'm retired, but I still have a studio in Brooklyn. I want you to come see me. Saturday, 2 o'clock. Can you do that?" Daniel took the card with trembling fingers. The name meant nothing to him, but something in the old man's eyes made his heart race. "I'd have to ask my mom." "But why? What for?" "Because in 40 years of working in music, I've only heard 3 people with what you have. Real talent, the kind that can't be taught. You're the 4th. Lawrence's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was commenting on the weather. "That piece you played tonight, the one that wasn't on any classical playlist. That was yours, wasn't it?" Daniel nodded, unable to speak. "I want to hear the rest of them. Everything you've written, everything you've composed." Lawrence glanced around the massive penthouse at all the wealth displayed so carelessly. "You don't belong here playing background music. You belong on a stage where people actually listen." Before Daniel could respond, his mother appeared in the doorway. She looked exhausted, her feet probably hurting from hours of standing. When she saw Daniel talking to one of the guests, worry crossed her face. Had something gone wrong? Was there a complaint? Mrs. Chen? Lawrence turned to her, his voice gentler now. Your son is extraordinarily talented. I'd like to work with him if you'll allow it. Maria looked between Lawrence and Daniel, confusion and caution mixing on her face. I'm sorry, I don't understand. Work with him how? Lawrence explained who he was, about the studio, about what he'd heard in Daniel's playing. As he talked, Maria's expression shifted from caution to disbelief to something that might have been hope, though she was clearly trying not to let it show too much. Hope was dangerous when you'd been disappointed before. This isn't some scam, she asked finally, her voice protective. You're not asking for money? No money. I'm retired. I do this because I still love music and because talent like your son's is too rare to waste. Lawrence looked at Daniel again. Saturday at 2. My address is on the card. Don't be late. He walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. Oh, and Daniel, bring everything you've written. Sheet music, recordings, whatever you have. I want to hear it all. Then he was gone, leaving Daniel and his mother standing in Victoria's living room, holding a business card that felt like it might be made of something more than paper, something like possibility. They didn't tell Victoria about the conversation. The next morning, when she complimented Maria on how well the party went, she mentioned Daniel exactly once. Your son did fine on the piano. Nothing special, but adequate for background music. Maria just nodded and went back to cleaning the kitchen. She didn't mention that a legendary music producer had called her son extraordinary. She didn't mention the card hidden in Daniel's notebook. Some things were better kept quiet, at least for now. Victoria lived in her own world, and Maria had learned long ago that her employer only saw what she wanted to see. Saturday came slowly, each day feeling like a week. Daniel could barely concentrate at school. He spent his free time organizing his compositions, printing out the ones he'd written down, recording rough versions of the ones that only existed in his head. 12 pieces total. Some were short, just 3 or 4 minutes. Others were longer, more complex. Each one told a story, even if he'd never explained that to anyone. At 1:45 on Saturday afternoon, Daniel and his mother stood outside a brownstone in Brooklyn. It looked normal from the outside, just another building on a tree-lined street. Maria squeezed his shoulder. Whatever happens, I'm proud of you. You know that, right? Daniel nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He clutched his folder of sheet music like a lifeline and climbed the steps. His mother stayed at the bottom, giving him space. This was his moment. Lawrence answered on the first knock like he'd been waiting by the door. Right on time. Good. Come in. The inside of the brownstone looked nothing like Daniel expected. The front room had been converted into a small concert hall. A grand piano sat in the center, surrounded by acoustic panels. Recording equipment lined one wall, professional-grade stuff that Daniel had only seen in videos. Speakers, mixing boards, microphones on stands. This wasn't just a hobby studio. This was real. Sit, Lawrence said, gesturing to the piano. Play me what you played the other night. The piece about your mother. Daniel's head snapped up. I never said it was about my mother. You didn't have to. Music tells the truth even when we try to hide it. Lawrence settled into a chair, his full attention focused on Daniel. Now play, and this time don't hold back. There's nobody here to impress. Nobody to stay quiet for. Just play it the way you hear it in your head. Daniel sat at the bench. He put his hands on the keys, and for the first time in his life he played for someone who was actually listening. Really, truly listening with their whole attention, with the kind of focus that made every note matter. The piece poured out of him, bigger and bolder than he'd played it at Victoria's party. He'd been holding back that night, trying to stay in the background like he was told. But now, in this small studio with this strange old man who somehow understood, Daniel let the music be what it was meant to be. Powerful, emotional, true. When the last note faded, Lawrence didn't clap. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just sat there, his eyes closed, letting the silence settle. Then he opened his eyes and looked at Daniel with an expression the teenager couldn't quite read. How many more do you have? 11. 11 more pieces. Play them. All of them. I'm not going anywhere, so Daniel played, one piece after another, each composition spilling out of him like water from a broken dam. Lawrence recorded everything, taking notes, asking questions between pieces. Where did this melody come from? What inspired this rhythm? Why this key change? He treated Daniel's music with a seriousness, a respect, that the teenager had never experienced before. 4 hours later, when the last piece ended, Lawrence stood up and started making phone calls. Right there, right in front of Daniel, like he couldn't wait another minute. He called people with titles like director and professor and chairman. He used words like prodigy and exceptional and once in a generation. Daniel sat at the piano, exhausted and exhilarated and terrified all at once, listening to this stranger rearrange the world on his behalf. His mother had come inside at some point and stood in the doorway, tears running down her face that she didn't bother to wipe away. "All right," Lawrence said finally, ending his last call. "Here's what's going to happen." Lawrence explained his plan while Maria gripped the back of a chair so hard her knuckles turned white. There was a showcase coming up in 3 weeks at Carnegie Hall. Not the main stage, he was honest about that. A smaller venue, but still Carnegie Hall. Still one of the most prestigious addresses in music. He'd secured Daniel a slot to perform 3 of his original compositions. 3 weeks? Maria's voice cracked. That's so soon. What if he's not ready? He's ready now, Lawrence said simply. He's been ready. The world just hasn't heard him yet. Beyond the showcase, Lawrence had already arranged for Daniel to audition for Juilliard's pre-college program. Full scholarship, he'd made sure of that. If Daniel got in, he'd study with some of the best instructors in the world. Every Saturday, real training. The kind that cost other families $50,000 a year. Daniel felt like he was in a dream. The kind where you're afraid to move too much because you might wake up and find out none of it was real. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You don't even know me." Lawrence looked at him for a long moment. "When I was 17, I was playing in a subway station for spare change. A man heard me and changed my life. He paid for my education, introduced me to people, believed in me when nobody else did." He gestured around the studio. "Everything I have, everything I became, started because one person stopped and listened. I've been looking for a chance to pay that forward for 20 years. You're that chance, Daniel." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur. Daniel went to school, came home, and practiced. Lawrence coached him every evening, helping him refine the pieces, teaching him how to perform, not just play. "Playing is technical," Lawrence explained. "Performing is about connection. You're not just making sound. You're telling a story to people who chose to listen." They picked 3 compositions for the showcase: The Weight of Water, the piece about his mother; Concrete Dreams, which captured the rhythm and chaos of the city; and Invisible, a newer piece Daniel had written just days after Victoria's party, about being seen and unseen, about existing in spaces that don't acknowledge you. During the day, life at Victoria's penthouse continued exactly as before. Daniel still helped his mother sometimes, still did his homework at the kitchen table. Victoria never asked where they went in the evenings. She never noticed that Maria's eyes looked tired from staying up late, watching her son practice. She never wondered why Daniel sometimes hummed unfamiliar melodies while he worked. To Victoria, they were still just the housekeeper and her son, background characters in her life. She was too busy planning her next event, her next appearance, her next opportunity to be seen by the right people. 10 days before the showcase, Lawrence invited music critics to attend. He didn't tell Daniel this, didn't want to add pressure. But word started spreading in certain circles. A legendary producer bringing a new talent to Carnegie Hall. People were curious. An editor from the New York Times marked it in his calendar. A scout from a major record label planned to attend. Daniel knew none of this. He just practiced, poured everything he had into those 3 pieces. His mother would sit in the corner of their small apartment listening, crying sometimes, though she tried to hide it. She'd left her entire life behind in another country to give him opportunities. Now those opportunities were becoming real, and it terrified her as much as it filled her with pride. The night before the showcase, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind running through every note, every transition, every moment where something could go wrong. What if he froze? What if his hands shook? What if everyone realized he was just a kid who didn't belong on that stage? His mother knocked softly and came in without waiting for an answer. She sat on the edge of his bed like she used to when he was little and had nightmares. "You know what I think about when I'm scared?" She asked. "What?" "I think about the moment I decided to leave home. I was 23 and I had a good job, a nice apartment, people who loved me. But I wanted more for my future, more for the children I might have someday, So I got on a plane with 2 suitcases and came to a country where I didn't speak the language, where I didn't know anyone. She smoothed his hair back from his forehead. That was terrifying. But I did it anyway because the dream was bigger than the fear. What if I mess up tomorrow? Then you mess up, and you learn from it, and you try again. She smiled at him. But you won't mess up. You know why? Because when you play, you tell the truth, and the truth doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be real. The next evening, Daniel stood backstage at Carnegie Hall, and the reality of what was happening hit him all at once. This was Carnegie Hall. People like Rachmaninoff and Horowitz had played here, legends, icons, and here he was, 16 years old, about to perform music he'd written in a tiny apartment while his mother slept. Lawrence appeared beside him, calm as ever. You ready? I think I'm going to throw up. Good, that means you care. Lawrence straightened Daniel's collar. The suit he was wearing was new, bought specially for tonight. It fit him properly, made him look older, more confident than he felt. Remember, you're not playing for them. You're playing for you. For your mother. For everyone who's ever felt invisible. Let the music speak. The small venue was packed. About 200 seats, everyone filled. Daniel peeked through the curtain and saw faces he didn't recognize, all waiting. His mother sat in the front row, wearing her best dress, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that he could see it from backstage. Then the lights dimmed, and someone was introducing him. The words floated past without landing. Something about emerging talent, about original compositions, about Lawrence Whitmore's discovery. And then Daniel was walking out onto the stage, his legs somehow carrying him even though he couldn't feel them. He sat at the piano, looked out at all those faces, took a breath, and began to play. The weight of water came first. His fingers found the keys like coming home, and suddenly the fear dropped away. This was what he knew. This was where he belonged. The music poured out of him, telling his mother's story, telling his story, telling the story of everyone who'd ever sacrificed for someone they loved. In the front row, his mother wept openly. Around the room, people leaned forward. This wasn't what they'd expected. This wasn't some prodigy playing technical exercises. This was art. This was truth wrapped in melody. Concrete dreams followed, capturing the pulse of the city, the constant motion, the hope and hustle and heartbreak all mixed together. Daniel's hands flew across the keys, his whole body moving with the rhythm. He wasn't thinking anymore, wasn't worried about mistakes. He was just playing, just being, just letting the music be what it needed to be. And then Invisible, the final piece. It started quiet, hesitant, like someone trying not to be seen. Then it grew, became louder, more insistent. The melody demanded attention, refused to be ignored. It built and built until the entire piano seemed to vibrate with sound, with emotion, with the simple declaration that I am here, I exist, I matter. The final chord rang out and faded into silence. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, nobody moved. Daniel sat frozen at the piano, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Then the audience exploded. They stood up, all of them, clapping so hard it sounded like thunder. Some were crying. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief. The critic from the New York Times was already typing notes into his phone, his fingers racing to capture what he'd just witnessed. Daniel stood and took a bow, his legs shaking, tears in his own eyes. He found his mother in the crowd and saw her face radiant with joy and pride and relief. Lawrence stood off to the side, not clapping, just nodding with satisfaction. This was what he'd heard that night at Victoria's party. This was what he'd known was possible. Backstage afterward, people surrounded Daniel. Business cards, congratulations, questions about his next performance. A woman from a record label wanted to talk about recording his compositions. The director of Juilliard's program shook his hand and said the audition was a formality at this point. A reporter asked if she could interview him for a feature story. Daniel answered as best he could, overwhelmed, grateful, still not quite believing any of it was real. His mother stood beside him, quiet and proud, her hand on his shoulder. That night, the critic from the New York Times posted his review online. By morning, it had gone viral. The headline read, 16-year-old composer stuns Carnegie Hall audience with raw, honest brilliance. The article told Daniel's story. The housekeeper's son who'd taught himself to compose. The teenager who'd been playing background music at society parties while genius went unnoticed. the young artist who'd turned struggle and invisibility into something beautiful. By Monday morning, the story was everywhere. Social media, news websites, morning talk shows, videos of Daniel's performance racked up millions of views. People shared it with captions like, "This is what real talent looks like," and "Everyone needs to hear this." Victoria Ashford was eating breakfast in her penthouse, scrolling through her phone when a friend texted her a link. "Isn't this your housekeeper's son?" the message asked. Victoria clicked the link, saw Daniel's face, read the headline, felt her stomach drop as she realized what she'd missed, what had been right there in her home all along. Victoria read the article 3 times before it fully sank in. Daniel Chen, Maria's son, the quiet kid who did homework at her kitchen table, the same boy she'd asked to play background music at her party, the one she'd dismissed with barely a glance, was now being called a genius by the New York Times, a once-in-a-generation talent. She scrolled through the comments under the article. Thousands of them. People were talking about the irony of it all, how he'd been playing at a wealthy socialite's party and nobody had noticed, how the rich guests had consumed his music like elevator ambiance while something extraordinary was happening right in front of them. Some comments were gentle, others less so. More than a few people mentioned Victoria by name, though the article hadn't included it. The internet had done its detective work. Her phone started ringing. Friends wanting to know if it was true, if this was really her housekeeper's son. Reporters asking for comments. Someone from a morning show requesting an interview about discovering Daniel's talent. Victoria ignored them all, her mind racing. She remembered that night now with uncomfortable clarity. She'd been so focused on the Rothsteins, on securing donations, on being seen by the right people. The piano had just been background noise to her, a problem solved, a box checked. She'd walked past Daniel a dozen times and never really looked at him. Not once. When Maria arrived for work that Monday morning, Victoria was waiting in the living room. It was unusual. Victoria typically stayed in her bedroom until late morning, leaving instructions via text. But there she sat, coffee growing cold in her cup, the New York Times article pulled up on her tablet. "Maria," Victoria said, and something in her voice made Maria stop in the doorway. "I saw the news about Daniel, about his performance." Maria's expression was careful, guarded. "Yes, why didn't you tell me? When Mr. Whitmore first reached out, when Daniel was preparing for Carnegie Hall, why didn't you say anything?" The question hung in the air between them. Maria set down her bag slowly, choosing her words with the same care she'd used for 3 years working in this house. "Would it have mattered to you, Miss Ashford?" The honest answer was probably no, and they both knew it. Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He played at my party. I hired him to play. That means I helped launch his career. I gave him that opportunity." "You asked him to play background music." Maria's voice was quiet but firm. "You told him to be pleasant and quiet, to not distract from conversations. That's not an opportunity. That's being invisible. But Victoria started, then stopped. She wanted to argue, wanted to claim some credit, some connection to Daniel's success. But the words felt hollow even before she said them. "I'd like to host a celebration. For Daniel. Introduce him to people who could help his career. I know everyone in New York. I could open doors for him." "He doesn't need doors opened anymore, Miss Ashford. Mr. Whitmore handled that." Maria picked up her cleaning supplies. "If you'll excuse me, I have work to do." "Wait." Victoria stood up, uncomfortable with this shift in dynamic. Maria had never spoken to her this directly before. "I want to help. Let me do something. A fundraiser for his education, or he has a full scholarship to Juilliard. 3 record labels want to sign him. A documentary crew asked to film his story." Maria looked at Victoria fully for the first time. "My son doesn't need your help. He never did. He needed someone to see him. That's all, and you never did." The words landed like a slap. Not cruel, just true. Victoria opened her mouth to respond but couldn't find words that didn't sound defensive or hollow. "I'm giving my 2 weeks' notice," Maria said. "Mr. Whitmore offered me a job managing his studio. Better pay, better hours. Hours where I can actually watch my son perform instead of serving champagne to people who don't say thank you." Victoria felt panic rise in her chest. Maria was the best housekeeper she'd ever had. The apartment ran smoothly because of her. "Maria, please, don't be hasty. I'll give you a raise. 20%. 30. It's not about money." Maria's voice was gentle now, almost pitying. It's about respect. About being seen as a person, not just staff. Your money can't buy that, Miss Ashford. You have to choose to give it. She walked toward the kitchen, leaving Victoria standing alone in her enormous living room, surrounded by expensive things that suddenly felt very empty. The 2 weeks passed quickly. Victoria tried several times to engage Maria in conversation, to somehow fix what had broken, but the walls were up now. Professional politeness, nothing more. Maria did her job perfectly until the last day, then handed over her keys and left without ceremony. Daniel's success kept growing. More performances booked, an album deal signed, features in magazines and on news programs. Everywhere Victoria looked, it seemed like Daniel's face was there. This kid she'd barely noticed becoming someone the whole world wanted to know. She watched an interview he did on a late-night talk show. The host asked him about playing at society parties before his big break. Daniel was gracious about it. Didn't name names, but he talked about feeling invisible, about how people consumed his music without ever wondering who was creating it. The audience reacted with sympathy and anger on his behalf. But someone did see you, the host said. Mr. Whitmore, what was that moment like? Daniel's face lit up. He was the first person who looked at me like I was actually there. Like I mattered. That changed everything. Victoria turned off the TV. She'd been at that party. She'd walked past that piano a dozen times. She could have been the one to notice, to listen, to see. But she'd been too wrapped up in her own world, too focused on appearances and status and impressing people who probably didn't think about her 10 minutes after leaving her parties. 3 months later, Victoria received an invitation in the mail. Daniel was performing at Lincoln Center, a major venue, a sold-out show. The invitation was formal, generic, probably sent to hundreds of people. Nothing personal about it, but she decided to go anyway. She bought a ticket like everyone else. Not a VIP seat, nothing special. Just a regular ticket in the middle section. She showed up early and sat among the crowd of people who were there because they loved music, because they wanted to hear what this young composer had to say. The lights went down. Daniel walked onto the stage and the audience erupted in applause before he even reached the piano. He looked confident now, comfortable in this space in a way he'd never looked in her penthouse. He sat down, smiled at the crowd, and began to play. Victoria heard the music differently this time. Really heard it. The complexity, the emotion, the way each note seemed to carry weight and meaning. This was what had been playing in her living room that night, and she'd missed it completely. She'd been standing 10 feet away from genius and heard nothing but background noise. Halfway through the performance, Daniel played a new piece. This one's called The Gift of Being Seen, he told the audience. It's dedicated to Lawrence Whitmore, who taught me that being talented isn't enough. Someone has to notice. Someone has to care. The piece was beautiful, grateful, full of light. Victoria felt tears on her cheeks and didn't wipe them away. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd had the chance to be that person, to be the one who noticed. Instead, she'd been too blind to see what was right in front of her. When the performance ended and the audience stood to applaud, Victoria stood with them. She clapped until her hands hurt, adding her voice to the chorus of people celebrating Daniel's talent. But she didn't try to go backstage afterward. Didn't attempt to push her way into the crowd of well-wishers. What would she say? That she was sorry? That she understood now? She left the theater and stood on the street outside, watching people stream out, everyone talking excitedly about what they'd just witnessed. A couple walked past her, the woman saying to her companion, "Can you imagine having that much talent and no one noticing? Thank God someone finally did." Victoria pulled her coat tighter against the cold and started walking. She thought about her apartment, about all the beautiful things filling it, the art she'd bought but never really looked at, the books on shelves she'd never read, the piano she'd purchased for decoration and never learned to play. She'd spent her whole life collecting things, surrounding herself with expensive objects and the right people, trying to prove she mattered, that she belonged at the top. But standing there on that cold street, watching strangers celebrate someone's genuine talent, Victoria understood something she'd never grasped before. She'd had meaning living right there in her home, genius performing in her living room, and she'd been too self-absorbed to notice. She'd asked for background music and she'd gotten art. She'd wanted someone to fade into the wallpaper and she'd ignored someone who deserved a spotlight. The money would always be there, The penthouse, the parties, the social connections. But she'd lost something she could never get back. The chance to be part of something real, the opportunity to see someone when it would have mattered most. Victoria hailed a taxi and gave her address. She'd go home to her empty apartment, cleaned now by a new housekeeper who was professional but not Maria. She'd eat dinner alone and plan her next event. Life would continue exactly as it had before. But something had shifted inside her, a small crack in the certainty she'd always carried. Daniel Chen didn't need her recognition now. He had the world's attention, but maybe, just maybe, Victoria could learn to actually see people before they became famous. Before the whole world noticed, maybe she could learn to listen to music instead of just hearing it. To see people instead of just looking past them. It was a small thing, but it was something. And for Victoria Ashford, who'd always had everything except genuine connection, it might be the most important lesson she'd ever learn, even if she'd learned it far too late.